We are excited. We are here for the third annual of the Big Y panel, Star Stories Meet Humanities. And of course, we welcome you out there on YouTube, or if you're watching it later, still on YouTube, because this is a series that has a couple others before it. We've had historical storytelling featured. We have had contemporary folktale retellings featured, and the genre or the type of story today would be star stories. So very excited about that. We're also thankful for our American Sign Language interpreters. We have Heather and Amy with us who'll be switching on and off. And we also have our special guests. And of course, I'm going to have them turn on their video so we can see them for sure. So come on so we can see you. Okay. So we're going to get you all spotlighted and make it really official. So who we have before us? We have Dr. Brian Sturm, and he is out there in North Carolina. But guess what? Dr. Amy Sale is also from North Carolina. For some reason, I think they know each other. Wait, they do. They have worked many times together with STAR programs and in storytelling and on the science side too, with festivals and events galore, and just a thrill and honor for them to be here. And we also are thrilled for the funding. So for this to even take place, we have a big shout out to the National Endowment for the Humanities and for Utah Humanities. And we're going to talk stories and humanities today on this wonderful day, June 11th, 2022. And so without further ado, I know that Dr. Sturm and Dr. Sale have plenty to say, but from now on, everybody, they will be Brian and Amy. So don't worry, they still have their wonderful titles, but they do prefer Brian and Amy. And also, you'll notice a couple times the screen will be shared. It will only be for a short time. And because of the ASL interpretation, there will not be any interpreting during that time, but it either will be before or after, so you won't miss anything. So with that said, let's put our hands in the air, or in that YouTube chat or wherever you are, just put your hands in the air or clap them or put in some emojis or something, reactions. This is the time. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and Heather and Amy as well, and all the team at Story Crossroads. Amy Sale and I are very, very excited to be here, and looking forward to sharing some time with you all and talking about stars, star stories, the humanities. But when we were talking with Rachel early on and deciding what to do and what topic to cover, we were having this really interesting conversation about the sciences and the humanities and the way in which they are often seen in opposition to each other. Dr. Doolittle might have called it the push me pull you of academia. But there are also a lot of really important synergies between the sciences and the humanities. And for me, at least, as a storyteller, as a librarian, as an educator, I find that science and data, at least to me, are often incomprehensible. And maybe to the average person, that's also true. And so there needs to be some sort of translation that goes on. And for me, the humanities are what translate the sciences and the data into something that's accessible. And so you might even be able to say that the humanities humanize the ineffable and the incomprehensible, like cosmological phenomena, making them more accessible, more familiar, and more memorable. So we came up with this idea. As a way of beginning to merge those two. And as I was thinking about and talking with Amy and Rachel about these star stories, it sort of came to me that there are at least two ways in which stories work. There's the experience of stories, and then there's the meaning of the stories themselves. And let me pause a moment and share my screen here again. So the experience of stories I have in that image, I had a heart icon. For me, the experience of stories is an emotional one. And when I teach my storytelling class here at the University of North Carolina, I focus on this sense of emotional engagement. The experience of stories is typically one of enjoyment. It's one of engagement. And if the story really resonates with the listener, it can induce a light altered state of consciousness, what I have called in the past a story listening trance. Why does it do that? We're not completely sure, but there are some scholars who believe that our brains are actually wired for story, that we actually think in story, that there's an emotional involvement that is that's somewhat overpowering to us, and that the visual spatial processing that goes on predominantly in the right hemisphere of the brain engages us into a space in which we are just accepting of whatever we hear. And so we aren't critical in the same kind of way we might normally be. There's also some brain research that talks about vicarious experience and the way in which the brain has what are being called mirror neurons, because they fire, the brain cells fire in your head not when you experience something, but when you see somebody else experiencing something. And so these mirror neurons are the ways in which, at least the current science believes, the way in which we connect with the storyteller, or the story that we're hearing, or the actions that we're seeing, because our brains are experiencing it as if it were happening to us. But then there's also this issue of the meaning of stories, the story content itself. And in the image, I had a question mark for that. Again, for me, that the meaning of stories is something that is perhaps more cerebral, although they do have emotional meaning and emotional memory. But the meaning of stories is often found in the motifs in the story, little pieces of story that occur again and again across cultures, in the archetypes that are embedded in these stories, in cultural metaphors and the symbolism that the stories represent, because they aren't necessarily realistic. And you'll hear more from Amy about that later. But they have underlying themes. These star stories, yes, they're about stars, but they have these themes that run through them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there is an intellectual component, one might say a left brain component, and there's an emotional, visual, spatial, right brain component. So my philosophy is that storytelling and stories and story listening are whole brain experiences. Now, there's another way in which these stories work, and that is that they explain how things came to be the way they are. And the French would call these pourquoi stories. They're stories that, again, explain why the grass is green, or why the sky is blue, or why there are stars in the sky. And you'll hear several of those stories throughout our presentation today. So these stories can act as, the themes of these stories can act as guides for us. They speak to us about how to live, how to be, how to grow. And so our premise then is the following. So our premise is that the stars and star stories can be guides, both literal and metaphorical, that help us navigate our world. And I think Amy has a very powerful example of that to share with us.
Thanks, Brian. And thank you, Rachel, for having us. And thank you to our ASL interpreters also. So I'm Amy Sale. I am an informal science educator. I communicate astronomy to the public in a planetarium, at sky watching events, and on night paddles. And I really like to incorporate star stories into what I do. And I'm just going to start right off with a famous story that is told throughout Asia. There's a number of different versions of this story. I'm going to tell you one particular Chinese version that I really like. And this is how it goes. A long time ago, in a small village in China, there lived a young man with his water buffalo. They would work the fields during the day, and then at night, they would go to the river, and the water buffalo would play in the water of the river, and the young man would lie on the riverbank and play his bamboo flute. And one night, the music of this flute traveled up and up and up, all the way to the realm of the heavens, where the queen mother and the king father lived with their daughter, the weaver princess. Her job was to sit at the heavenly loom and weave colorful silks that she would drape across the clouds to dry. And on this one night, she heard the music of the flute. She was curious, so she traveled from cloud to cloud all the way to the ground, where she met the young man. They talked, they sang, and they fell madly in love. And they were very happy together. Time went by, the water buffalo, it grew old and sick, and right before it died, it said, "You must sew my hide into a cloak, because the cloak will perform a miracle for you." Well, soon the young man needed a miracle, because the queen mother had been walking by the heavenly loom one day and realized it had gotten rather dusty. She had not seen her daughter in a long time. So the heavenly guards were ordered to go to earth, find the weaver princess, and bring her back to the sky, where she sat at the heavenly loom and she just watered the heavenly gardens with her tears. On clear nights, the young man would look up at the sky and try to see if he could get a glimpse of the weaver princess, until he remembered the buffalo cloak. He put it on, and a miracle happened. He was lifted up into the sky, and soon he could see the heavenly loom. He could see the weaver princess rushing out to greet him with a big smile on her face, and he could see behind her the queen mother, who pulled a silver pin out of her hair and drew a silver river across the sky. And then she turned the young man into a star, Altair, and then turned her own daughter, the weaver princess, into another star, Vega, and placed them on opposite sides of the silver river, so they would never see each other again. But the king father took pity on the couple, and he decreed that once a year, on the 7th day of the 7th month, the magpies of the heavens would form a bridge across the silver river, and the weaver princess could cross over and hang out with her lover for one day. And on that day, there is to be a big feast to celebrate the couple. I've been told by visitors to our planetarium from China that it is Chinese Valentine's Day. And if there is a rainbow in the sky, obviously it's the weaver princess. In her haste to get to her young man, she has strewn her colorful silks across the sky. And that night, if it rains, it's the weaver princess sobbing, because she has to return to the other side of the silver river for a whole nother year. So in a moment, I'm going to show you an image of the sky, where you can see these two stars, and also a third star that makes up altogether, they make up a pattern that you might know as the summer triangle. And if you look closely, you might see the Milky Way. The starlight of the Milky Way is the silver river running between Altair and Vega. And I'm going to show you the sky as it looks like an hour and a half after sunset tonight, June 11th, as it looks like from North Carolina. And if you happen to not be watching this from North Carolina, don't worry, you probably have roughly the same sky. What matters in terms of what sky you see is not where you are east-west on the globe, it's where you are north-south on the globe. So if you are watching this from the mid-northern latitudes, pretty much anywhere in the United States, a good swath of Asia, Europe, Northern Africa, you're going to see the same sky. So I'll share it with you, and then I'll stop talking so you can look at it for a few seconds. Okay, and I do want to leave you with a little bit of a story epilogue here, which is that I don't want you to leave here with the impression that Vega at any time of the year takes a jog across the Milky Way and hangs out with Altair. So the stars, everything's moving. The stars are moving, but other than our sun, which is in our own solar system, so it's relatively close to us, the other stars, they are so far away from us that you're not going to notice, for the most part, their motions relative to one another over a short period of time, like a human lifetime, or even many human lifetimes. That's a small drop in the whole cosmic scheme of things. So this story that I just shared with you of the Weaver Princess, it's very old. It's many hundreds of years old. The people who originally told it, they saw the same sky that we can see tonight. So we are connected to the people who came before us and the people who will come after us by the night sky and by the stories that we share about it. The sky is our cultural heritage. Okay, so Brian mentioned that star stories can provide a guide to navigating life, metaphorically and literally. And I know Brian's probably going to say more about the lessons and meanings of stories like the Weaver Princess story, but I want to really make this point that the sky literally does provide us, if you pay attention, with a compass, a clock, a calendar, and even a time machine. So I want to show you an image that kind of gets at the compass and clock concept. And in honor of our host, Rachel, being in Utah, this is going to be an image from Utah, from Bryce Canyon National Park. You'll see the hoodoos, the rock formations of the park, and then you'll see it's a long exposure photograph. So you're going to see star trails. So I'll share the screen and then and get to the right slide, and then I'll let you look at it for a few seconds. Okay, if you were looking closely at that image, you saw that the stars over time, they look like they make big circles in the sky, but there's one point that acts as a pivot point. That is the point in the sky that is directly over Earth's North Pole. It's the northern celestial pole. So what that means is because Earth is always rotating, it spins on its axis every 24 hours, that makes the whole sky appear to turn around us. But there is a pivot point, and there happens to be a star that marks that point pretty well. It's not exactly in the right place, but it's close enough to do the job. And it's called Polaris, and it's our North Star. And if you pay attention to some of these star stories, they are indicating that. For example, there's a story told by people native to Utah that the North Star is a mountain sheep that has gotten stuck at the top of a really tall mountain and been turned into a star. And those other stars tracing out circles around it, those are the other mountain sheep endlessly circling the base of the mountain, trying to find a way to join their friend at the top. So that story is about a star that acts as a guide to humans, helping us find our way. So the sky is like a compass. But because of Earth's rotation, the sky appears to turn around us every 24 hours, which means it also acts like a clock, with the sun rising in the east, passing across the sky, setting in the west, and then the stars turning at night, marking the passage of time. And there are a number of stories that get at that. And Brian, I think you have a really good one about day and night.
Oh, I do. Yeah, no, it's a great story. This is a story that comes from the Nez Perce people, or the Yakama Nation, people of the Yakama Nation in the Northwest. And it's a story about why, it's a pourquoi tale, why we have one day and one night. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, a long time ago, in the early days, there was no consistency to the light and the darkness. Sometimes it would be light for a long, long time. And then, poof, the light would go out and it would be pitch black. Sometimes it would be dark for a long, long time. And then, poof, the light would come on. Well, the animals who loved the light enjoyed it while the light was there, but they didn't like it particularly when the darkness took them just as they were about to take a bite of some juicy grass or just about to catch an animal, because then they couldn't see. And the animals who loved the darkness, well, they didn't like it when the light suddenly came on and ruined their hunting either. So all of the animals got together and they said, we must talk to the Creator and ask for some consistency to the day and the night. And so Eagle agreed to fly up and talk to Creator. And up, up, up on his majestic wings, he flew higher and higher to the Sky Kingdom. And when he reached there, he talked to the Creator, saying, please give us some consistency to the light and the dark. And the Creator said, okay, I will do that. But I need to know how much light you want and how much darkness. Oh, said Eagle, I don't know what the animals want. I will go back and ask them. And the Creator said, better yet, go back and have a contest. And whoever can say what they want, the longest and the loudest, I'll do it that way. Okay, said Eagle, and once again he spread his enormous wings and he flew back down, down, down to the waiting animals. And he told them that they would have a shouting contest to see how much light and how much darkness the animals would have. Well, Bear, with his great big voice, he thought to himself, I know what I want. And in his loudest voice, he said, 10 years of darkness, one day. 10 years of darkness, one day. 10 years of darkness, one day. And all of the animals who loved the darkness gathered around Bear and began to chant along with him. But Rabbit didn't like the darkness. She thought to herself, I don't want that much darkness. I'd rather have 10 years of light and one night. And so she began to shout as loud as she possibly could. 10 years of light and one night. 10 years of light and one night. 10 years of light and one night. And Bear in his great voice and all of his friends were shouting, 10 years of darkness, one day. And they shouted on and on. And Turtle began to think about this, and he thought to himself, nope, I don't like either one of those ideas. I would rather have 5 years of light and 5 years of darkness. And so he began to shout as well. 5 years of light, 5 years of darkness. And on they shouted. Bear with his great rumbling, bullying voice, Rabbit with her smaller but persistent voice, and Turtle with his slow ways, talking and talking and yelling and yelling. And on they went, until finally they all began to get tired, and their voices went down and down as they became hoarse, and they simply couldn't speak any longer. And then, off in the distance, they heard another voice that they hadn't heard before. And they stopped and listened. And coming through over the airwaves, they could hear, one day, one night, one day, one night, one day, one night. And all of the animals thought, who is that? And so they followed the sound and they came down to the edge of the pond, and there was Frog. And Frog had been shouting the whole time, but nobody could hear him over the other animals. But he never gave up. He just kept shouting, one day, one night, one day, one night. And he was just getting warmed up while all the other animals were absolutely exhausted. And the Creator, looking down, realized that from then on, we would have one day and one night. And so it is today.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. I love that story. And it just goes to show, if you pay attention, you can tell time with the sky because of Earth's rotation. You can also tell a time of year. Earth has another really important motion in that it orbits around the sun. And as it does so, the nighttime side of Earth faces a slightly different part of the Milky Way galaxy every night. So on average, stars rise and set 4 minutes earlier each night. And so what that means is if you look at the same time of night, from night to night to night, month to month, season to season, you're going to see different sets of stars. So certain constellations are better seen at certain times of the year than others. And understanding this is important for survival. Being able to tell the time of year is important for knowing when to plant crops or harvest them, or when to time your religious ceremonies. So I have a really short story for you that illustrates how the sky is like a calendar. It is one particular version of a Greek myth, and I really like it. It's super short, and this is how it goes. Orion, the hunter, was a mighty hunter, and he boasts one day that no beast on earth could ever escape from him. And that was asking for it. So the gods sent a tiny scorpion to prove him wrong, and that scorpion stung Orion on the heel fatally. But before Orion died, he got his revenge. He clubbed the scorpion to death. So it was like this double homicide. And then the gods placed the two enemies on opposite sides of the sky so they would never see each other again. And that, according to Greek myth, is why you see Orion best in the winter, but the scorpion best in the summer. Okay, so I have bad news. If you're hoping to see Orion tonight on June 11th, it is literally the worst time of year because you can't go anywhere on the planet to get a view of Orion. He's in line of sight with the sun. So I have an image of the sky that I'm going to show you. It'll show you the scorpion where it is at midnight tonight and where Orion is right now. And I think this will make the point of how the sky is like a calendar. So let me get the right slide queued up. Okay, and when I was talking with Brian about this program, I was telling him how I enjoyed how often in fiction, when there are a different kind of story, when stars are referred to in those kinds of stories, it's often wrong. For example, in J.K. Rowling's book 5 of the Harry Potter series, she has Harry Potter take an impossible astronomy exam. It is June, it is midnight, and he is marking down the constellation of Orion on his star chart. So he would have needed to do serious magic to make that happen. He would have had to move Earth in its orbit to be able to pull that off. Okay, so I've mentioned how the sky literally can guide us. It provides us with a compass, a clock, and a calendar. There's also something else it provides us with, which is a time machine. And I mean this more in a literal sense than a metaphorical sense. And I'm going to tell you a different kind of story about a star, and it involves the star Arcturus. You can see it tonight, almost certainly, wherever you're watching this from. For mid-northern latitudes like Utah and North Carolina, this star is the brightest star visible in the sky in the spring and the summer, which means that it's the first star that you could potentially see popping out of evening twilight tonight. So I hope you'll go out tonight if it's clear, maybe half an hour after sunset, watch the stars start to come out. And one of the first ones you should see will be Arcturus. It's an orangish star. It's near the top of the sky. You can also find it by arcing off the handle of the Big Dipper, arc off the handle to the star Arcturus. And then you should think of the nursery rhyme, starlight, star bright, first star I see tonight. I wish I may, I wish I might have the wish I wish tonight. Okay, so go ahead and take a couple seconds to think of your wish. Okay, and when you're making your wish tonight on Arcturus, I hope you will think of this true story that illustrates how the sky is like a time machine. Okay, so the story itself takes place back in time. It takes place in the year 1933 in the city of Chicago. And just for a little context, that's between the two world wars, Great Depression era. 1933 was so long ago, the telegraph system was still in operation then. And the city of Chicago was getting ready to host a really big event, the months-long World's Fair. Second time Chicago had the honor of hosting a World's Fair. So this is a showcase of technology and culture of that era from around the world. And the opening night was May 27th, 1933. There were thousands of people gathered on the shores of Lake Michigan in the dark. And this is how they turned the lights on. They aimed 4 telescopes in 4 different US states. Not one of these telescopes was in Chicago. And they aimed the telescopes at the star Arcturus. Starlight from Arcturus was allowed to collect through the telescopes onto photocells. Photocells, that was new technology in 1933. Photocells can take light, turn it into a form of electrical energy that they then amplified and sent to Chicago via telegraph. That then resulted in a switch being flipped, which then activated the entire outdoor lighting system for the World's Fair. Starlight from Arcturus opened the 1933 World's Fair. Okay, so what does this have to do with the whole sky as a time machine? It has to do with why they chose Arcturus for the big honor. So astronomers thought that Arcturus was 40 light years away. So a light year, it sounds like it's a unit of time. It's really a unit of distance. 1 light year is the distance light travels in a year. And you might think about that for a second. How fast does light travel? Really fast, fastest thing in the universe, 186,000 miles a second. So in 1 year, light travels an almost unimaginable distance. It's nearly 6 trillion miles. So 40 light years away, that means that this star is so far away that the starlight hitting Earth in 1933 and having all those effects, opening the World's Fair, that starlight would have left the star 40 years earlier in the year 1893. And the significance of that year in Chicago history, it's the first time they hosted a World's Fair. That's why they picked Arcturus. Unfortunately, there's an epilogue to this story. They picked the wrong star. Arcturus is not 40 light years away. This is an example of the science story changing as we learn more information. Our best estimate now is that Arcturus is actually 36.7 light years away. So for simplicity, I'm going to round to 37. What that means is if you go out tonight and you make your wish on Arcturus as it's popping out of that evening twilight, you are wishing on 37-year-old starlight. You will be seeing the star as it looked when the light left it 37 years ago in the year 1985. In a very real sense, you will be looking at the year 1985. The sky is a time machine. Everything that you see in the sky, you're seeing as it looked back in time when the light left it. And a lot of these stories that we share about the stars a lot of them are origin stories, as Brian mentioned. They're about, where did the sun come from? Where did the moon come from? Where did we come from? And that, of course, are questions that science is interested in answering too. So we just launched a few months ago a very powerful time machine. into space. The James Webb Space Telescope will start returning its first scientific images this July. And because it can see so far away, it can actually see really far back in time. It can look over 13.5 billion years into the past. That's almost to the beginning of the universe. And so what it means is it can see the very first stars and galaxies forming and help us understand our origins in another way, a way different from these star stories. Okay, Brian, I'm gonna send it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Amy. That was absolutely fascinating. The idea that the night sky that we somewhat all take for granted, partly because we can't see it due to ambient light in our towns and cities, but that it could be, if we paid attention to it, could guide us that way. Actually, literally guide us in understanding our world is truly fascinating. A compass, a clock, a calendar, and a time machine. That's great. So I want to do a little shift here and talk about the sort of the meaning of stories. And this is perhaps where some of the other humanities that we haven't yet addressed come in. English literary analysis could be part of this. Certainly psychology and anthropology and folklore, all of those fit into your thinking, or should fit into your thinking about stories and star stories. But the themes of these stories, these star stories, are underlying the starness of them, right? They are stories about stars, but they're also about how do you cope with life, right? There are life skills involved in all of these stories. The themes of some of them are kindness, love, honor, duty, courage, pride, all of the human emotions, and a variety of different social situations. And then if you think psychologically, the meaning of the story runs even deeper than that surface meaning. My father, when he was alive, was a professor, a university professor, so it kind of runs in the family, I guess. And he was interested in myths and origin stories, and he took a Jungian interpretive perspective. He was not a psychologist, he was a philosopher and a theologian, but he got fascinated by Jungian psychology and interpretation of myth. Read a lot of Joseph Campbell. And his way of approaching these stories in our conversations, as I became more and more interested in story and folklore, was to say, Brian, there are ways to interpret these stories that move them from the literary or folkloristic to the deeply psychological and personal. And I said, Dad, I know. I've read some of these symbol dictionaries that explain the symbolism behind some of these stories. And he said, yes, that's one approach. But he said, the approach I like to take is much more personal. It doesn't have you look up the meaning of a particular symbol in someone else's interpretive dictionary. The approach I like to take, he told me, was to think about the story with, and he said, the X part of me. I said, what do you mean by the X part of me? And he said, well, what you do, Ryan, is you take the story and you take its elements and you think about them as parts of your own sense of self, part of your own psychodynamics, part of who you are and how you address the world. And the stories will then guide you to think very personally about your relationship to that story and your relationship to the world. So I said, Dad, that sounds fascinating. I still don't understand. Can you give me an example, please? And he said, take the story of Hansel and Gretel. You have two children who are abandoned by their father in the woods, who find their way home, and are abandoned a second time, where they encounter a witch. They overcome the witch, working together, gather her jewels, and go home triumphant. I said, okay, good. Yes, I know that story. He said, all right, so think about it as the child part of me that has to go on a journey into the forest, which could represent whatever it does to you. You have to interpret this for yourself. So what does the forest part of you mean, Brian? He said. I said, well, to me, that's the unknown. It's the unfamiliar, somewhere I wouldn't normally walk, certainly not as a child. And he said, okay, so the child part of you has to walk in the unknown until eventually it meets the witch. What does the witch mean to you, Brian? And I said, well, you know, the symbol dictionaries say all sorts of things about the witch. And he said, no, but what does it mean to you? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, the witch is someone who is unfamiliar, someone who is typically an adult, someone who is often kind of scary, threatening. Does that work? And he said, yes. So the child part of you has to go on a journey and be confronted by, in the unknown, has to be confronted by a threatening kind of force. What happens when that happens? The child part of you grows up, works together with its counterpart, masculine and feminine working together, and they overcome that threat, gather the jewels, and go home and celebrate. So he said, Brian, this story can be a story of the journey of your childhood into adulthood. It's a transformation story in that way. I thought, oh, that's really cool. So I can do that with any story. And he said, yes, you can take any story and do that process and figure out how does it resonate for you as an individual. It'll resonate with other people differently because they'll interpret those symbols differently. But okay, so I can make personal meaning out of each of these stories. So when I was preparing for this, I took that approach, the X part of me, and I thought about Amy's story about the Weaver Princess. And I thought, okay, so on one level, it's a story about why the stars are in the sky the way they are, with the Milky Way running between them. But on another level, in terms of English literary analysis or thematic analysis, it's a story about honoring your own passions and the love that you have for someone, regardless of the external powers and what they're demanding of you, right? So the external forces demand that they be separated because they love each other, and but the internal passion drives them to survive and to thrive in spite of it. So on that level, it's a story of the external forces, the social demands, the duty, responsibility, and then how that plays and to what extent it plays in the lives of your internal drives and your internal passions. And then I thought, okay, well, what if I did this X part of me thing? So I thought, okay, there is a masculine part of me that's a shepherd in some of the versions of that story. And then there's the weaver maid, the feminine, and the two, masculine and feminine, fall in love and want to intermingle. And society, the social forces, pull them apart and keep them separated, except for occasionally when they can get back together. When they are separated, they're deeply, deeply lonely and unhappy. When they work together and are together, that's when their bliss arrives. And so I thought, okay, this could be a story on a rather superficial level of relationships, right? But my father's approach was the individual. And so I had to say, all right, well, what about the masculine part of me and the feminine part of me? What do those mean? What does the weaver represent for me? And I thought, well, it's a nurturer. It's a someone who draws threads together. It's someone who creates and is innovative. What does the shepherd mean to me? The shepherd is also a nurturer. It is someone who is very practical versus the weaver who may be, well, both practical, but perhaps more artistic. And so as I thought about the weaver story, I thought, well, to me then, this is the story of the practical person that I am and the innovative, creative person that I am, that are only really, and I as a person, as an integrated person, I'm only really happy when I honor both of those things. When they are separated and forced to be apart, I am not happy. So I interpreted that story just for myself, not for anyone else, but for myself as this story of the integration of my creative side and my practical side, and my need to pay attention to both, not just one. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, what about my story? The one day, one night story. And I'm not going to go into the deep psychological analysis of that one. I've given you an example of how that works, and two examples actually. But the one day, one night story, yes, it's a pourquoi tale about why we have one day and one night. But it's also a story, thematically, about the value of persistence over intimidation. The great bear with his big voice and his bullying attitude saying, I'm going to dominate this contest and win it. And the little frog who doesn't fight, he just stays and speaks and speaks and speaks. And it's the persistence when you have a good idea like that, that transcends. So these stories have similar stories, as Amy was saying. There are similar stories in different cultures, and different cultures look up at the night sky and see very different things. The same way they have similar kinds of stories to explain other kinds of phenomena. For example, floods. Flooding happens all the time in all countries, or most countries. And those cultures will have stories about floods. And so the story about why the sun and moon live in the sky from the Efik people of southern Nigeria is a story about sun and moon living together and going to visit their friend, water, the ocean. And then eventually they ask ocean, well, why don't you ever come and visit us? And ocean says, I am too big to fit into your house. And so sun and moon create an enormous house just so that ocean can come visit. And so they invite ocean in, and ocean comes up to the door and says, are you sure you want me to come in? Me and all of my family. And sun and moon say, yes, yes, please come in. And so sun comes in and he floods the ground floor. Do you want me to come in further? Asks ocean. Yes, please, come in, come in. And so ocean comes in and floods the second floor. And sun and moon have to climb up onto the roof. And eventually they keep inviting ocean in, and ocean covers the house, and sun and moon have to jump up into the sky, and they live there to this day. So yes, it's an explanation of why sun and moon live in the sky, but it's also a cautionary tale of planning, consequences, the issue of pride. It's also a catastrophic flood story, right? I mean, ocean comes in and floods everything. And flood stories abound in many, many cultures. And the Sumerian culture around 2000 BCE, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a flood story. The one that probably pops to many of your minds is the biblical Noah's Ark story. And there's a similar story in the Greek tradition of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The Aztecs have a flood story of Tata and Nena. And then there are stories from India and China and Scandinavia and Aboriginal Australia and Native America and Polynesia. I mean, the list just goes on and on with these flood stories. And folklorists have been fascinated for years trying to figure out why different cultures have similar stories. And extensive work has been done trying to trace similar story types, as they're called, to different cultures. And probably the best known one, at least in Western culture, is the Cinderella type. It has been found all over the globe. And they all fit the same basic story form. Similarly, when one community, since we are one community, as Amy said, we're all looking up at a similar night sky, at least in the Northern Hemisphere we do. And so it makes sense that we invent stories to explain the phenomena we see up there, the same way we invent stories to explain the world down here around us. But what's really intriguing is how different cultures adapt stories of the natural world, like the sky, to fit their local contexts. In the story that Amy told of the Weaver Princess, the Milky Way is a river in Chinese folklore. But in Hawaiian culture, there's a wonderful story about the king of the sharks who is manhandled by one of the culture heroes of the Hawaiians and thrown up into the sky. And so the Milky Way is a giant shark stretched across the sky. In Armenian lore, the Milky Way is a path of spilled straw. In Khoisan lore, the people of the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa, it's a trail of fiery embers. And in Estonian folklore, it's a wedding veil. And I think Amy has a story about that.
I do. I love this story because it's, presumably it was not meant to be a science story, but it actually relates to a lot of the concepts I've already mentioned. So this is how it goes. In a land far to the north, there lived a beautiful maiden named Lindu, and she had charge of the birds. She would warn them when the snow was approaching, and she would direct them on special sky paths to warmer lands. And then in the spring, she would bring them back. And she did this with such skill and such kindness that soon everyone wanted to marry Lindu. And suitors descended from the sky to ask for her hand. So first, in a crystal sleigh drawn by a single crystal horse, out of it stepped North Star. And North Star bowed down before Lindu. And he said, "Lindu, please marry me. I would be a dependable husband. You'd always know where to find me." Lindu thought about this. This was true, but North Star, he was so distant, about 400 light years, and unchanging and unmoving. And she said, "No, North Star, we would never go anywhere. I cannot marry you." Well, next, out of the sky, 4 silver horses pulled a silver chariot, and out of it stepped Moon. And Moon bowed down before Lindu, and he said, "Lindu, please marry me. I would be a romantic husband. With me, you could travel to a new place each night." Lindu thought about this. This was true, but Moon, he was so changeable. And his path across the sky, it really was quite narrow. "No, Moon," Lindu said, "I cannot marry you." Well, next, 12 golden horses pulled a golden carriage out of the sky, and out of it stepped Sun. And Sun bowed down before Lindu and said, "Lindu, marry me, my light. We will light the day, we'll warm the winds, we'll make the seasons come and go. Oh, and by the way, I move through the sky too." Then Lindu thought about this is true, but Sun's light, it was harsh. She'd be lost in his glare, have to hide in his shadow, and his path, at least over the year, more narrow than even Moon's. "No, Sun," Lindu said. cannot marry you. Well, finally, it was close to midnight and shimmering colored light appeared throughout the sky, and 100 rainbow colored horses pulled a gleaming black carriage down to earth. And out of it stepped Prince Borealis, Lord of the Northern Lights. And he bowed down before Lindu and said, Lindu, marry me. My light, it's gentle and soothing. I can travel the whole sky. I come and go as I please. And Lindu thought about this, and she thought, and she said, yes, Prince Borealis, I will marry you. And they danced across the sky while the world slept beneath them. Well, when dawn came, the prince had to fade away, but he asked Lindu to begin preparing for the wedding. And so she gathered sparkle from the dewdrops, iridescence from the dragonfly wings, and she began to weave a wedding veil so delicate it could scarcely be seen. That night, she waited for the prince, but he didn't return. So she continued to weave her wedding veil. It became quite long over the nights and the days. It reached to the ends of the earth, and still no Prince Borealis. Lindu began to weep. The birds fluttered around her, carried her up to the sky, crowned her with stars, and that's where she dwells today as Queen of the Sky. Up there, North Star is her constant friend. Moon leaves his path once a month to say hello, and Sun sends warm greetings every day. From time to time, she even dances again with Prince Borealis, but she'll never marry him. She now understands, too unreliable of a husband. If you go out tonight and you have a nice, clear, dark sky, you will see Lindu's wedding veil stretching delicately from one horizon to the other.
That's a great story. Thank you, Amy. I'm aware of our time, and I want to make sure that we leave time for questions as well. I find it interesting with this Milky Way, particularly, that there are so many stories because it's such a distinctive aspect of the sky. The Maori of New Zealand, for example, see a divine canoe, that the Milky Way is a canoe. In Aboriginal Australia, the Milky Way is a band of termites stretching across the sky. And to the Cherokee people, it's a trail of cornmeal that goes across the sky as well. So all of these people, all of us, look up into the night sky and we make our own personal connections. We understand the sky and the world around us through a marvelous amalgam of scientific discovery, imagination, and cultural inheritance, and we draw our own experiences of the stars and of the heavens. We take those and we turn them into our own conversational narratives. Just as a quick example, I had an experience when I was scuba diving in Australia. We went on a night dive, and the stars were literally 180 degrees. It went from horizon to horizon uninterrupted because there were no lights out there on the reef. And so stars just everywhere. You could see them with such clarity. But the really amazing thing was that when we went underwater, there were bioluminescent plankton in the ocean. And if you wafted your hand through the water, those plankton glowed. And so they looked like stars under the water. And so what we did is we sat in the water, floated with our eyes half above and half below, wafting gently in the water. And we ended up with a dome of stars overhead and a dome of stars surrounding us. Amy, I think you have a personal experience story too, don't you?
I do. I love that one. I hope everybody right now is thinking about their night sky stories. The one I'm going to share with you is technically a daytime story. Some of you may remember August 2017, we had a total solar eclipse and the path of totality cut across the continental United States. And so I met some friends and family in Central Oregon. And I'm going to show you in a moment, I'll show you a couple of images from that trip. You're going to see my stepsister, Emily, holding the North Carolina spokespot, Kelvin, who's behind me here, wearing eclipse glasses. He's been wearing them continuously since 2017. And we got stuck in this giant traffic jam trying to make it to the site where we were going to camp. There were thousands of people at this site in Madras, Oregon. And the second image I will show you is my stepsister Emily and I and our cousin Kate, all sitting together with our eclipse glasses. We are in the path of totality. It's a few minutes before totality hit us. And what you'll see if you look really careful at the image, there's a mountain behind us. It's the second tallest mountain in Oregon, Mount Jefferson. And it's of course way more impressive when you were there in reality. In the picture, it's hard to see. It's miles and miles away. What happened is the moon's shadow, when the moon lined up with the sun, the moon's shadow hit that mountain first before it hit us. And the shadow swallowed the mountain. That's what it looked like. It looked like the mountain vanished. And the thousands of people we were with just roared in response. And then minutes later, or actually it was just seconds later, the shadow hit us and it was like a black curtain dropped over us and day became night and created the memory of a lifetime and a story we will continue to tell the rest of our lives. So I'll let you all look at these two images. Let me get the right image queued up for you and I'll stop talking while I show them. Okay, so again, I really hope all of you are going to go out in the sky tonight and maybe make your own stories about what you see or what you experience in the sky. And I think we're ready for Q&A.
How exciting. So grateful for that foundation. I always find that's really important before we get to the questions. And we definitely have questions. Are you ready? Of course you're ready. And those of you watching in the stream, I have noted a couple of your questions and you can also continue asking questions as well. And so I will do my best to be on the lookout of that. And looking at the questions, of course, this is about with the humanities. Now, it may be one that we definitely have covered here and there. But this one, I'm gearing this for Brian. Why are cultural studies important to Star Stories? Now, cultural studies is very important in the humanities, so we definitely want to know. Why are cultural studies important for Star Stories?
That's a great question. I think for me, the value there is that, again, we sort of addressed that a little bit here when we talked about the way in which these stories represent cultures. They transmit cultural knowledge, some of them. They are stories, at least the stories that we've told here are typically what we call folk tales, right? And so they come from the people. And the culture studies, I think, is a way to, for me, it's a way to look at stories and think about how do we explain ourselves to the world as unique cultures, but also as part of a broader humanity. And this is one of the beauties for me of the Star Stories, is that when you look up into the sky, as Amy was saying, in the Northern Hemisphere, we see the same sky. In the Southern Hemisphere, you see the same sky. And so, and some of them you actually share across those hemispheres, right? The equatorial stars. And so we're all using these star stories to try and create meaning that is individual, is culturally specific, but is pan-cultural at the same time. And so I think where culture studies adds real depth for us is to explore these variants across cultures of similar stories, to shed light on the uniquely personal and uniquely cultural aspects, but also to share that sort of common humanity and to make connections.
Wonderful. And thanks for summarizing that up so beautifully. I definitely have noticed in the chat, or I guess it's technically it's a stream because it's YouTube, that that people are definitely engaged with all that you're saying. So thank you so much for those beautiful words. I have another question. This time it's for Amy. How do you capture those fragments of culture without cultural appropriation? Now, let me just let everyone know, in the Big Y panel series, every time we've done, it doesn't matter the genre or type, it always seems to be something we bring up as cultural appropriation. Our first one was historical storytelling. Our second one was on contemporary folktale retellings, and Star Stories. Here it is again. So I'm gonna say the question again. How do you capture those fragments of culture without cultural appropriation?
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I'll be curious to hear if Brian has anything to add to it. Brian and I were actually talking about this question earlier, and we talked about the importance of being respectful when telling the story. Just telling it with respect. You're not making fun of it. You are, trying to do your best to research where the story comes from. I was nervous the very first time that I was going to do a cultural star story program at the planetarium. I wanted to do a Native American Sky Stories program. And so I met with some of the folks at the American Indian Center at the university where Brian and I both work, UNC Chapel Hill, to ask for advice on what did I need to know. And they emphasized to me the importance of recognizing that there's not just one monolithic, Native American culture. There are various groups of people. There are different things that are important to different groups of people, that if you pay attention to the stories, that you can learn a lot about the specific culture and what's important to them and what sort of cultural norms they have about how should men act, how should women act, how should children be in relation to their elders. And I've tried to apply those same principles when I have done African Sky Stories program, Asian Sky Stories, and that kind of thing as well, because I tell stories from all around the world, and I am not from all of those places. So if I limited myself to only, my specific place, that would make my repertoire very, very small. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Brian.
No, I think you did a lovely job there. I agree with what you say too. I think there are ways of sharing stories. When I share stories, I do it as an entertainer. I do not pretend that I am a cultural ambassador or that I represent the culture at all. But if I feel as though if I try and share these magnificent stories which need to be told and want to be told, and bring them from the folklore and share them out, then what I'm trying to do is serve somewhat as a mirror for people to see their own selves, somewhat as a window so that people can actually see through the story to another culture and begin to understand it, or at least encounter it. And then hopefully that by doing both of those things, showing yourself and showing the other, you can open and it becomes a sliding door, and you can actually then feel more comfortable connecting with other people from other cultures.
Well, thank you so much to both of you on that particular question. This question, though, I am going to aim it towards Brian. And this one, and not that you couldn't answer, Amy. So if you said you're inspired, you can wave your hand or something. But for sure, Brian, how does storytelling and the humanities help in creative thinking, especially in regards to Star Stories? Mm-hmm. And then the second part is, how do Star Stories help in those creative thinking goals?
Yeah. So creativity is an intriguing thing, and there's been a fair amount of research on creativity. The scholar I have found most compelling for me is Arthur Koestler. And he wrote a book in 1964 called The Act of Creation, in which he talks about the creative moment being when you take an idea or a concept in one frame of reference and then superimpose it into another frame of reference. And if you think about it, a metaphor or metaphoric language or figurative language is exactly that, right? You understand it in one frame of or one context, and then you take that out of context and put it into a new one. And that moment, according to Arthur Koestler, is a moment of creative generativity. And I think that is one of the ways in which we use narrative and we use story to make sense of something that in its own context, we have no way to understand, right? So I think about if I had no scientific knowledge of thunder, why wouldn't I think that there were giants walking across the sky or bowling balls across the sky or rolling rocks or, you know, whatever? I would take whatever I had in my context and try and make sense of the experience that I was having. And I think star stories are similar. You look up at the sky and you think, what are those things? You know, how do they stay up there? What is going on? And you make up stories. You create a narrative to explain it to yourself, partly, I think, to get over the fear of not knowing what it is, but partly also for the sheer joy of the creative expression. And I think with storytelling itself, for me, the beauty of storytelling is that it doesn't have a given visual to go with it. If you read a book, or you read aloud a book with pictures in it, or you watch a video on the internet, you're given the pictures, and that can be really useful for younger children, but for older children particularly, just giving them the sound waves requires a moment of deep creativity on their part. And stories, like any good story, either a picture book or a novel or a movie, whatever it is, there's information that is not given, right? It's left up to the imagination of the listener to fill in those details. And what's really interesting is that sort of space between the story as told or performed and the story that is heard and received. And the good storytellers and the good movie producers know not to super saturate the information that they give to the audience, because they want the audience to bring forth their own meanings, their own interpretations, and their own imagination. So I think it's an immensely creative process, the storytelling process, but also the star stories themselves really push us to be creative, because you look up there and you can draw any picture you want, right? It's like looking at a cloud. You can turn it into anything you want. That's up to your imagination.
Oh, that is so true. And I have a feeling that, Amy, you have something to say about that too.
I do, Brian, what you just said. I was thinking one of my favorite things in planetarium shows is to show people a set of stars. And I might put up like an outline, you know, connect the dots with the stars. But then I'll ask the audience, what do you see? And it's really entertaining what some of the kids will come up with, their visual imagination that they're using. And just another anecdote, often when I tell stories, kids will ask questions like, well, why did Coyote do that? I don't think that makes sense. I think Coyote should have blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, they're writing fan fiction about the story that I just told. Like they're like already adapting it in their own minds and making another creative story out of it. So I love seeing that in action.
Well, thank you so much. I love that you both jumped in on that one. There was a question specifically from Elizabeth. So I know, Elizabeth, you're still there. You had a specific question kind of going back, and this was, I believe, Brian, when you were talking about with the Weaver story. Have you compared and contrasted the differences between the Oxboy Weaver story as it's told in China and Vietnam, Japan and Korea? If so, what did you learn from it that you can share with audiences?
Great question, Elizabeth. Thank you for it. I have not spent a lot of time with that particular story cross-culturally, but I will say that there is a tool that is immensely useful for that, that we can originally, thanks to Thompson with his motif index of folk literature. And then Margaret Reed MacDonald did a child's version of that, of children's stories from around the world, where she analyzed pieces of the story and indexed them. And what that does is it draws those pieces together in the index so that you can actually do cross-cultural comparisons. So the Storyteller's Sourcebook is an invaluable tool for doing this kind of comparison across cultures, because it brings them all basically together so that you can see the differences there. Amy, have you done anything with that particular story cross-culturally?
No, I was just going to add, so way back when, I actually was a student in your class, Brian, as I know you remember, and I did a comparison of stories about the Pleiades star cluster, and I was trying to remember, it's pulling it out of long-term memory here, but it goes by a lot of different names. The Pleiades, the Seven Sisters. In Japan, it's Subaru, and check out the emblem on a Subaru car to see why. And it's a cluster of stars within the constellation of Taurus. And what's interesting to me is it's actually a true cluster. Like usually when stars look like they're close together, like in a constellation, they're not. Constellations they're made up. They're human inventions. They're not natural star groupings for the most part. But the Pleiades is an actual star grouping. They're a group of stars that was born out of the same cloud of dust and gas, and they're still moving together in space. And lots of different cultures have stories about it. And they so often are about people escaping to the sky. To the Onondaga, there are 7 star dancers that ended up dancing together in the sky. To the Wenatchee, there are 6 onion-eating wives who husbands didn't want them anymore. And so they left and escaped together into the sky. And there's actually another star cluster chasing them across the sky, the Hyades, the husbands who realized they erred and they actually missed their wives. There are little girls being chased by a bear, to the Kiowa. And anyway, to me, that's fascinating that so many different cultures, it can all be people escaping.
And besides that, I see that someone was asking about, let's see, let me just add everyone's spotlight back. That's always sometimes tricky when we have the American Sign Language. So let's do that. Okay, so what we have is a list in the stream of a bibliography of Star Stories, and that was put together. We are very grateful for that, so you can check it out. I know, Janet, you specifically asked about a reading list of resources that support creativity, storytelling, and imagination. And as you heard, Star Stories can already bring that up, so I think that could answer that particular question of yours. But the next question that I have is, do you find it necessary to talk about clothing or attire, because in humanities that is a big deal, to help the audience connect with your character when telling star stories? Why or why not? So when we did historical storytelling, that was an obvious thing. Some definitely do the historical garb and everything. Contemporary folktale, I've seen people do things that way. Now we're into star stories. What do you say to that, Amy?
Well, I'm usually telling stories in the dark in a planetarium or under the night sky. So it's sort of irrelevant what I'm wearing. And I don't tell stories as a character. The one kind of exception is actually in Utah. I'll be at the Bryce Canyon Astronomy Festival soon, later this month. and doing a program called Star Stories, and we do that in the light. And for the final story, it's the Perseus and Andromeda story with Medusa, and I make the audience act it out. So I don't give them clothes to wear, but I do give them props. It's actually my way of enticing them to come up and volunteer to be in the story. So I'll tell the story and then they act it out and utter any dialogue they feel moved to do. And I've got this great set of props that this Park Service employee lets me borrow whenever I go. And he made this amazing set. He made this incredible Medusa head with like rubber snakes tied to this mannequin head. And people really enjoy acting out that story.
And then Brian, you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I also don't wear costume. I don't wear any traditional clothing when I tell stories. I have a belief, and this partly comes from my dissertation work on the entrancing power of storytelling, that when people get into what I call the story listening trance, they are really deeply enmeshed in the story and the mental visualization process of it. And yes, they're watching you as a performer, but they're also watching this video going on in their heads, right? And so I tell my students that I firmly believe that if we are doing our job really, really well, then in some ways, we almost become invisible. That the people are looking through us and beyond us to the drama of the story that you're trying to create. And so, what I'm wearing, what I'm doing, they will notice it, but I don't, for myself as a storyteller, I don't want to draw attention to that. I know there are some people who do, and it's very, very effective to use your clothing to accentuate the story and to support the story or the culture from which the story comes. But I've never chosen to do that.
That is good to know. So thank you for sharing that. Also, this is a question that Janet had put out there. She actually did it way early, and I promised that I'd bring it up. She would like to know, I mean, you're talking about attire, so it kind of goes into it too about the choices you make, but choices you make also in selecting or finding star stories. We do have the bibliography that we did put out there too. So any tips that you have for finding star stories? We'll start with Amy and then we'll follow up with Brian on that one.
Okay, Brian is definitely the expert on this. I literally edited the book on it. But one source I'll just mention, because I think people sometimes overlook it, is talk to your local librarian to help you find things. They are experts in this. I have found that children's books can be, so I usually rely on more than one source once I've identified a particular story I want to tell, and then I'll take elements from the different sources, but don't overlook children's picture books. The Weaver Princess story that I told, that version of it, I relied a fair amount on a particular, I'm trying to remember the author's name. I think it's Jean Lee, the author of that book, to tell that story. So, and then Brian, I know you have the expert advice on it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think your advice was the best. Go talk to your librarian. By far the best answer that could be given. Thank you for that. No, I mean, going back to the storytelling source book, it's a great resource. It's a very expensive book, but it also may be in your local public library and certainly in your local university or research library. They should have it. That's a resource that, again, allows you to do cross-cultural comparisons, but it also has the bibliography at the end that will lead you directly to a page number in the book to find a story. So it's a great story finding resource. The internet has become a fabulous resource for stories. Lots of people, lots of cultures are putting their stories up and making them accessible on the web. And so searching there, you do want to be a little careful with any of your story searching to not rely necessarily just on one resource, particularly on the internet. I have found a lot of stories that have been misattributed and misquoted on the internet. So, going back and trying to find other versions of the same story, tracing it back, doing your historical research. And I mean, honestly, it's a lot of fun to see, how these stories have evolved over time, how different cultures have addressed the same issue. So I guess I would say story finding is one of the real joys of, for me, at least, of being a storyteller and a scholar, is to say, well, let's dig a little bit and see whether this is actually true. Hearing other storytellers, going to storytelling festivals is a wonderful way to find stories that you can share. And the beauty of the folk literature is that it's not under copyright, right? This is oral tradition captured in print form. You do have to be careful with the internet if you watch someone else's performance that you don't take their performance of the story. That is a copyright infringement. And one of the reasons when I do my storytelling research, I like to try and merge some of the story elements, so long as you're not doing this sort of cultural obliteration in the process. But in order to try and avoid the taking of a picture book and telling it verbatim, I try and take the story elements, turn them into pictures in my head, and then put my own language to those stories. And then I go back and say, okay, are there any particular words or particular phrases or particular cultural references that I want to try and keep in the story? But by turning it into my own words, I get away from the issue of copyright infringement or taking someone else's work. And then I try and attribute it, right? I say, I got this from these sources.
Wonderful. We're getting very close on time, only a couple minutes, but so I want to say these things really quick. Starry Storytelling, so STARRY Storytelling. She had a specific comment to you, Brian, that she's done storytelling using biosensors and regarding the story trance that you might be interested in. So I'm just kind of putting it out there. So there's the Starry Storytelling, very fun.
Please contact me.
Yeah, so that's a yes. So it's, this is why real-time streaming is great. And then Alicia actually had a question of, have you heard about Korean stories, the sister sun and the brother moon and the herdsman and the weaver? And so you just kind of put it as kind of a FYI or a question like that. But she also asked an interesting question, because Brian, you specifically said that you don't go in as a culture ambassador. You are sharing more the entertainer, but even so, what is that role of the cultural ambassador? So even if you don't choose to do it, what is the duty of the storytellers if they do choose cultural ambassador?
This is a raging debate in the storytelling world. Who has the right to tell what stories? I think a lot of people tell the stories from their own culture and cultural heritage as a way to not run into cultural appropriation or misunderstanding. I think again, for me, the idea of cultural ambassador that I choose for my own work is not an ambassador of a culture or a representative of a culture, but a window to that culture, an open door that you can go through and explore on your own. But it's an invitation, I guess. I look at my role as a storyteller as an invitation to a culture.
Wonderful. Now, like I said, we are super close on time. I know that there may be other questions out there, but if you go to storycrossroads.org/thebigwhy, you will see the CVs, resumes of both Brian and Amy, so you can reach out to them. But I always like to have this final question as kind of a last chance for them. Is there anything you want to say that you didn't get to say yet? So I believe we'll do Brian and we'll end with Amy. And this is like our big hurrah. So what do you need to say?
I've had my big hurrah.
What do you need to say?
Half an hour of big hurrah.
Well, of course.
No, I don't really have anything to end on. Other than, go find these stories. They're fabulous. Tell them, share them, research them. I'd love to have a further conversation with Elizabeth and see whether they've had a chance to do that cross-cultural comparison of the Weaver Boy or the Ox Boy and the Weaver story. But just go read stories, go share stories, go tell stories.
And Amy?
That's great. And I'll add, look up at the sky also and create your own stories. And I just wanted, I guess, to end by saying, reminding us that when you go outside and you look up at the sky, half your field of view is the sky. At night, you are looking into the universe, and we all have a very personal, deep connection to the cosmos because the chemical elements in our body were forged in stars. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, that was all made in stars. As the astronomer Carl Sagan famously said, we're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
Oh, that is so beautiful. See, I knew you had to be those final words there too. Although, Brian, you were great too. But yes, those are beautiful, Amy. We appreciate everyone. That includes you out there streaming. And we always know we stream this, and then suddenly in 1 or 2 days, we get major views here. So this is your chance. You can then, once this is done, it will still be part of the Big Y. So if you go to storycrossroads.org/the Big Y, you will not only find this one that will add to the playlist, but there's the other two that I've mentioned a couple times during the stream. Besides that, there is in the stream a feedback form. It's really helpful. Remember, the funding that we love would be the National Endowment for the Humanities and Utah Humanities. When we have those feedback forms filled out, they continue to support us. So please do that. And then, of course, you'll see that there's other events there too. And I see Delana, thanks. That's very nice. Thanks to me, but really, you know what? Thanks to the ASL Interpreters. And very thankful to have them. And again, of course, Brian and Amy. So hands up in the air, everybody, put those emojis in the stream, spread the word. And within 5 or 10 minutes, I'm gonna update and make sure that this is part of the playlist for the Big Y. Until we tell again.